So thank you for coming to this edition of the Erlangen AI Hub seminar, and it's a pleasure to be here and present some ongoing recent work. And this is a slide which show joint work with a PhD student James Binnie at Cardiff, and Otto Sumray, who's a postdoc at the MPI for Cellular Biology and Genetics in Dresden. So this talk will be about the geometry of loops and how we can use topological data analysis on the Möbius band to understand geometric loops. So since we're part of the Erlangen AI Hub, this is a rather fitting talk to give because right there in the logo is a Möbius band. And I guess it's fitting that in our logo we could see that there's some topology in AI, because the Möbius band is an interesting topological object. And there are also some symmetries in AI. If you notice in our logo that the two E's are reflected. These are two main themes that we will explore in today's talk, how symmetry and topology actually play a role in data analysis where your data has interesting shape. So what is this Möbius band? Well, you might have seen these in sort of popular mathematics videos, but basically, if you take a piece of paper, like a square, and you take a pair of opposite sides, shown there, indicated there as the pair with two arrows along the edges. And if you try and glue the two sides together, not sort of directly, but if you twist one side before gluing the sides together, you get this shape on the right-hand side, which is the Möbius band or Möbius strip. So one thing you achieve with doing this sort of twisted gluing operation of the sides is you get an object which has only one side. So if you imagine tracing your finger along that strip, you would always end up on the same side, on a single side, whereas if you have a strip where it's just glued normally, you get a cylinder, then a cylinder has an inside and an outside, so there are two separate sides to it. So this has a different topology compared to the cylinder. To motivate why we care about these Möbius bands, let's look at the central data science problem we have, which is the study of geometric loops. And this is not an abstract problem because data do come in the form of loops. So if you have a 2D shape, you might describe its contour by looking at the curve, the closed curve that that encloses the shape. For example, we see in this 2D shape structure data set, which you'd find on the Curvy package, shapes that are represented by contours. You get frogs, you get cups, you get apples and butterflies and so on. And nice data science problem would be to try and use these contours as inputs, use these geometric loops as inputs, and try and train an algorithm that classifies these shapes based on their geometric loop representation. So you would like a machine learning algorithm to be able to distinguish an apple from a pencil. That might seem a bit synthetic, but in a lot of physical sciences and biology, there is abundance of data in the form of loops. And one example, study of the shape of cells. So in this data set, which you can find on the geomstats package, these are shapes of cancer cells. And you might want to study their shapes and create descriptors that allow you to distinguish between different cancer cell types. And that might be fed into machine learning algorithms that could help improve targeted drugs for cancer treatment. So far, we've only looked at 2D closed curves, but obviously, closed curves, these geometric loops can come in any dimensions. So, and in the study of proteins, these proteins are often represented as curves in 3D space, and often they have interesting knot behaviors. And so this is something that is of interest to a lot of biologists, and to see how these knots could affect different biological functions. And so if they take a computational approach, they would want a geometric descriptor of these shapes of proteins that take into account the geometric configuration that produces these knots. So let's take a moment to think about how these loops are actually represented in when you sort of feed it into a machine learning algorithm or any computer. So here by loop, we mean it is an embedding, a topological embedding of the circle into some Euclidean space. So we have points along a circle, and then this map gamma assigns each point along the circle a point in Euclidean space. And that's what we mean by loop. And that's how we sort of encode this information in a computer. So the objective here, the scientific objective, is we want a method, sort of a feature map, that takes the loop encoded by this map gamma and express geometric features of the loop as a vector which takes a vector f gamma. So this feature map takes a loop and outputs a vector. And machine learning methods could then take this vector and apply different transformations to it to achieve your desired task. However, this approach carries with it challenges, and these challenges come in the form of redundant symmetries. So the geometry does not depend on how we represent data. So the choice of this map gamma is actually a choice, a user-specified choice. It is not something that's inherent to the geometry. So there are two types of symmetries to take into account. One are external symmetries. These are choices of coordinates. So we could think about, for example, in the case of a cancer cell, it doesn't matter how I rotate my cancer cell on my Petri dish or under my microscope. The shape of the cancer cell stays the same. So we want any geometric description of our cancer cell to be invariant with respect to this rotational symmetry. There's also another form of symmetry, which is the internal symmetry, the choice of how we parametrize our curve with this map gamma. And for the same underlying geometry, there are infinitely many equivalent ways of representing the same data. So let's look at the first type of symmetry, which is the external symmetry. So here we took, on the left-hand side, a cancer cell contour image. We could sort of mirror it, so that's a mirror symmetry, or we could rotate this cancer cell. But so the diagnosis, any diagnosis you derive from the image should not depend on these sort of arbitrary transformations of your image. So more concretely, these transformations are so-called isometries. So what are isometries? These are transformations that preserve distance relations between points on the curve. And if we transform a loop by an isometry, that changes representation of the loop, but it is a geometric equivalent representation. So these external symmetries, transformation by external symmetries, are represented by composing the map gamma with another map omega, which represents the isometry. The other parameterization is the intrinsic one. So it's just, so when I put this in a computer, right? So I'm saying, okay, for this point on the circle, I'm mapping it to this point in space, and so on. So, but now that's a choice, right? It doesn't matter whether I start numbering from here 0 to 1 this way, that's a shifted representation, or instead of going, gosh, this is clockwise, I could also number things anti-clockwise, right? Or I could even have some more go across this loop at different speeds and index things as a distorted way. So in mathematical parlance, these are all homomorphic to each other. So, but you can just think of them as reparameterizations of the same object. So these are just the user-defined way of representing an object. And again, the object itself has nothing to do with that choice. So we should find ways of removing that user choice from data. So any questions at the moment? Okay, so just to summarize our objective for today, so it's to find a feature map that takes a parametrization of a geometric loop gamma and express this geometric feature as some kind of vector, right? So why a vector? It's because statistics and machine learning works with vectors. And we want this feature map to have desirable properties, right? So the first one we've touched on, so it's symmetry invariance, so meaning indifference to equivalent representations of the loop. So there are two types, the internal and external. So the internal one, the parametrization of circle one is the alpha, and the external one, the rotation one, is the omega. So depending on how I rotate the loop, how I parameterize the circle, I should have the same output. We should also want continuity. So if I vary my representation of the loop gamma continuously, then my feature vector should also change continuously. And the last thing is tame. So I want this to be, well, we'll get onto what that means in a bit. But basically, that it means that the output does not break a computer, right? So I could create a trivial example of something that satisfies the first two. That is bad. So if I just have a constant map that sends every loop to infinity, right? I mean, that's obviously, it's just a constant, right? So it just doesn't matter. The symmetry variance doesn't matter. It's constant, so it's continuous, but it's not what we hate, right? So it breaks the computer. So these are the three common sense conditions that we want to satisfy for anything we design. So I did my PhD in this, so of course I'm going to advocate this approach. But I think it's a very natural area where topological data analysis gives a nice framework of viewing sort of these geometric challenges. And here is the outline of what I'm going to talk about. So what we're going to do is we're starting with a geometric shape, and we're going to transform it in different ways until we get to something we want. So there are two steps. The first step is we're going to transform it into a function. We'll get onto what that is, but the first step is called chordal distance transform. Yeah, if you have better names for that, please let me know later, but that's the name we came up with. And then we're going to apply a very common tool in persistent homology called subloop set persistence. And we're going to turn a function into something called persistence diagrams or barcodes. So the geometric shape is represented by an embedding of a circle into a Euclidean space. This chordal distance transform is going to turn into a function on yes, the Möbius band. So that's where the Möbius band comes in. So we're going to turn it into a function on the Möbius band. This step removes the external symmetry that we want to get rid of. So this step removes the dependency of the representation on the rotations. However, we still have the issue of the internal parameterization. So this is the second step. This is where the standard technique comes in. But I'll mostly focus on this step today because that's the step that's new. But the purpose of topology is to identify topologically equivalent objects as the same thing. And we get very nice persistence diagrams. And we'll just briefly touch on how you can actually use persistence diagrams to do statistics at the end. So as promised, the first object is this chordal distance transform. So often if you go to a data science 101 course and you learn about things called k-nearest neighbors, yada yada yada, and they feed you some Python notebooks to play with, and probably in the first week you are asked to compute the distance matrix of some object, right? So here's what we're doing. This is kind of the starting point. We're just computing the distance matrix, okay? So for every point along the circle, we'll take the pair and then compute the distance between those two pairs. and then we order them in the same way along the circle. So this is, you can imagine I'm taking the distance of this bar, and then as I go along the x-axis, I'm changing this end of the bar along the circle, and along the other axis, I'm changing this other end of the bar. I know, and it's on purpose because, well, because the default way is of plotting this is the other way, right? So it is on purpose. But so if you order the points along the distance matrix in the natural way, right, along sort of how you order it along the circle, then you get this representation. So this one is for the circle, this is the distance matrix for the circle, and this is for the ellipse. You see, so this function already tells apart the two. So since we're taking two elements of the circle, right, and then computing the real number on two elements, the distance between 2 points, this is a function on the torus. So really, so these two sides are glued together, and the top and bottom sides are glued together. So this is a space that is not a square, but a torus, because we're looking at a circle here. So if you go along the bottom row, you come back to the same point on the other side. And so if you, this might be the more familiar picture of a torus in popular science. Maybe this is not, but you can imagine if I take a piece of square, I wrap both sides together, I get a cylinder, and then I then glue the two ends of the cylinder together, and I get this tube, right? This bicycle tube. However, that, you can see already from this picture that there's a symmetry here. There's some redundant information. So meaning there's a left, right, there's a diagonal symmetry here, right? If I flip the function left, right, it's the same. Not left, right, across, no. Flip this function across the diagonal, it's the same object. And that's because, no, this is measuring the distance between Z1 and Z2, and this point across the diagonal is measuring the distance between Z2 and Z1, and it's the same distance. So what we're really interested in is we want to get rid of that redundancy, right? So we sort of quotient by this symmetry of permuting the two things, and we obtain the Möbius band. And so what we really want to enumerate is just the space of these chords, right? So each chord is defined by two endpoints, but there are two equivalent representations of the same point by permuting the two endpoints. So this is how you get from that torus to a Möbius band. So as mentioned before, there's a symmetry across the diagonal. So stuff on one side of the diagonal is a copy of another. So we just cut it off, right? But then because this side of the diagonal is the same as that, so the symmetry means that this edge is the same as that edge. So these two edges are the same, right? So we could kind of glue those two edges together like this, but that's not very a bit hard to visualize because of that corner there. So an easier way to visualize this is then if we slice open this triangle, and then we get two triangles, and then we glue them back together, right? And then we get this Möbius band by gluing this side to this side. So we get this diagonal, and then we get these two edges, which we then glue together. Appreciate if you haven't seen these arguments before, it might be taking a bit of time to digest, but this is how you get to from a torus to Möbius band. This is the consequence of removing that redundant information due to symmetry. So this was the distance function on torus, right, of the circle on the torus. And once you go through this cut and paste thing, so you get rid of one of these, one copy of this, and you basically retain kind of a copy of here, which looks like this. And again, important that these two sides are not closed, they are glued together with opposite orientation. So this summarizes what we've done. We've gone from circle, distance matrix of points along a circle, which have redundant information. We've just sort of got rid of the extra copy of information we've got a function on the Möbius band. Okay. So what we're doing here is we are recording the length of chords along a circle, along a loop. And it's a function, obviously, on a space of chords. And that space of chords is parametrized by a Möbius band. So if you're not happy with the square, this is nice diagrams that James made. Who's right over there. He's working on this project with me and Otto, I just said at the very beginning. So this project is joint work between me, Otto Sumray from MPI-Dresden, and James from Cardiff. And so James made these nice figures. So this is the chordal distance transform function if the object, the shape is a circle, and the shape is an ellipse, then we have this function on the Möbius band. So hopefully this is easier to visualize. And if you're not happy with how I've explained the Möbius band, there's this fantastic video on a popular mathematics and beyond YouTube channel called 3 Blue, 1 Brown, and I'd highly recommend checking this one out. So, okay. So what have we defined? We have defined a transform that takes a geometric object or a parameterization of a geometric object to a function on some space. So it's a function taking embeddings of circles and to maps on Möbius band. So since we're dealing with a distance matrix, the object we started off with a distance matrix, by default, this thing is isometry invariant. So the distance matrix does not depend on how you rotate or your choice of isometric coordinates in Euclidean space. Something maybe less obvious is if this object is smooth, then this transform is also smooth. If this object is k times differentiable continuously, then this is also k times differentiable continuously on the Möbius band. That's not too hard to see, maybe, but then this transform is actually continuous with respect to Whitney's CK topology. This just says there's a natural way of quantifying what close embeddings mean, right, in this space. And so if we vary our embedding here continuously, then this function, this transform also varies continuously. And in fact, if you let k go to 0, so if we just look at continuous maps, continuous embeddings, then this is 2 Lipschitz, right? So we're okay, we've done this circus of throwing data from one form into another, but what does this mean? Is this thing actually formative? Well, the simplest example we could take is the ellipse. Okay, so what do you want from the ellipse? You want to know its maximum distance, the major axis and the minor axis. And actually, if you look at this diagram, so you can prove this is a 2-line calculation that so if you look at the chordal distance transform of an ellipse, the maximum of the chordal distance transform over here corresponds to the major axis, and the minor, the saddle point, there is always a saddle point, and the maximum corresponds to the minor axis, and those are the 2 critical points. So, okay, great. You could shove an ellipse into this thing and could read off the axes. But there's more. So you could look at all the critical points of this function and kind of interpret it in a nice way. So the minima of these functions, so there's a nice phase diagram, right? So on this corner of the phase diagram, they're the minima. So they correspond to geometric features of the loop, which look like they're 2 bits of the loop opposing each other. So they look like a repulsion between bits of your loop. The saddle points correspond to the points on the loop that are almost parallel, right? So if it is parallel, then you get saddle point. But there are these also sort of bending together type situations, and then these kind of almost parallel situations which induce saddle points. But once you satisfy a sort of a curvature condition relative to the separation between the 2 points, you sort of transition from one type of critical point to another. So the last one is, of course, a maximum. So this is stuff in this corner. So they represent things of attracting 2 bits of curve, attracting each other, trying to tie each other together. So we can have a sort of good handle on trying to interpret the significance of this object. This is just a picture in 2D. For things in higher dimensions, actually more things, you gain extra degrees of freedom, and the interpretation gets a bit more interesting. There's some, you call it torsion interpretation, but that's just an extra parameter, and my slides are 2D, so I don't want to throw in an extra dimension. So one thing that we prove in this work is this genericity of something called a Morse property. So we say a smooth function is Morse if all the critical points of the function are non-degenerate, in this case, meaning that they're either maxima, minima, or saddle points. And there are only finitely many of them. So if you imagine something that's not Morse, right? So it's something that has potentially infinitely many critical points, that is potentially meaning something that's not very well behaved with the function. But here is an example of a function that is well behaved and not Morse. So if you had taken, and this is the simplest example, which is the distance between 2 points of circle, you get this whole critical set. The maximum of this is not a single point, but a whole band. And these are the infinitely many critical points, and none of them are non-degenerate. Okay, so the simplest example is the counterexample to this generic property. But if you sneeze on a circle, you could always make it into an ellipse. That's how my supervisor always tells it, sneeze on something. So apparently it's not common parlance. And
slightly disgusting circle, that's what you get.
It's slightly, yeah. But yeah. So if you just perturb your circle a little bit, and you might get an ellipse, and that ellipse is something that has 2 critical points. One is a maximum, and one is a saddle point. So we are able to prove that, okay, for smooth embeddings of circles, so the set of those embeddings whose chordal distance transform these functions have this Morse property, finitely many critical points, and non-degenerate ones are generic in this sense. So it's first open. So for each such Morse embedding, if you look at the neighborhood of all such embeddings, all of them have finitely many critical points. You always find a small enough neighborhood where you look around it, all of them have finitely many critical points. The other thing is possibly more meaningful, which is any smooth embedding can be arbitrarily well approximated by an embedding that has this property. So for example, take a circle, I can arbitrarily approximate this function with a function of that from the saddle point. So this is kind of the big result we've proved. Any questions about this? Okay. So going back to our program. So, okay, we've defined this map, okay, from embeddings of circles into Euclidean space. So, well, functions on the Möbius span, right? Happy days, we know what to do with functions in maths. So let's look at our checklist. So yes, it is isometry invariant by design. However, it is not a parameterization invariant. So if I reparameterize my loop, I decide to walk around this loop faster and then walk around this a bit a little slower, or I decide to go clockwise and anti-clockwise, that does change. However, this is indeed a continuous transformation. It's 2 Lipschitz. We only restrict to continuous embeddings and not have higher requirements on differentiability. And it is also, I meant to change it to tame. So tame. So in the sense that embeddings generically have finitely many non-degenerate critical points. So you can't have a crazy function with infinitely many critical points popping out. So it's our step, okay. And now we come on to the second step. We go from the function, which we defined, so going from ellipse and Möbius band. And we want to go from the function on the Möbius band to something called persistence diagrams, using something called persistence homology, which gets rid of this topological equivalence between different representations of the same loop. So some of you would know about what homology is, but so homology is just some topological invariant, right? So what is the topological invariant? It's just something that doesn't change when I have deformed one thing continuously into another. So one thing that doesn't change when you deform things continuously from one to another is perhaps the connected components of a shape, the loops in a shape, the number of loops, and the number of holes, etc. So and homology is a way of quantifying that. So the Möbius band, it has homology degree 0, which measures connected components of 1. Homology degree 1, which measures cycles 1. And 1 goes around the circle. There's only one loop here. For a torus, you get 2 independent cycles, so that's one difference. And then it also encloses a 2-dimensional void, so you also get something non-trivial in higher dimensions of homology. So these are invariants that just categorize topological features of your space in different dimensions. And this is a nice object, right? Because this measurement does not depend on how we parameterize the space, right? How we stretch out our space. So this two-person homology is now when did it come up? Early 2000s. Is now 20-something years old. I think was still fairly newish when I did my PhD. Speak for yourself. But here's the basic idea in this setting. So there are many settings of persistent homology, but the one we're looking at concerns functions. And so we take a function, for example, one generated from the coordinates transform, and we look at this points on the space which have function value less than a certain parameter. So these are points where the distance of the chord is, the length of the chord is less than 1.5. And then as I increase this distance, I include more and more points, and the topology of this shape changes. So as an example, this is, again, the same ellipse, but I'm just parameterizing it in a different way. And I get a different circle, right? So it's different chord distance transform, but from the same underlying geometric object. This distortion is just a defect, artifact of how I'm parameterizing the circle. But notice that as I step through, right, as I change the subset set, all these are topologically equivalent. So by considering this filtration of sublevel sets and the topology of this filtration, I'm obtaining an object that is invariant with respect to this choice of parameterization. And how do you extract meaningful data from this? So you just sort of, I'm not going to define things properly here because it's kind of a general audience talk, but you just track the topological features, right? So t equals 0, things along the boundary, which is b equals 0, are present, are connected, and there is one cycle. So, and as I increase this parameter, well, up till 2, I mean, nothing changes. I still got one cycle. And then at value 2, which is this minor axis, I hit a critical point. I hit a saddle point. So what that gives me is I create a new cycle. And then, okay, fine, create a new cycle, and I increase it, nothing changes. Value 3, nothing changes. And at value 4, I hit the maximum corresponding to the major axis, and then everything is included in the set. So I track this cycle that we generated, and that cycle dies because it's being closed up by this hole. The cycle here is being closed up. Well, here's actually an interesting example of where, for experts only, this next 30 seconds of this hand waving, explanation kind of is not precise, because if you Exercise for experts in the audience: if you take things in Z mod 2 coefficients, because it's a Möbius band, it's not the same picture. Yeah, but for experts. So and also for experts, this is a nice property actually, because if we use Z mod 3 coefficients, we actually get rid of none of the infinite bars carry a meaningful information, and we could just only look at finite bars, and makes vectorization a lot easier. But that's inside. So okay, to complete the pipeline, here's what we've done. We've taken geometric shape, turned in the function on Möbius band, and then turned it into these sort of sets of intervals, which we call barcode. And in doing so, the first step removes the symmetry invariance. The second step removes the parametrization issue. And so we've got this collection of intervals, and you could, I'm not going to dwell on this too much, but the reason we want to do this is that you can actually do statistics on this. So one way of doing this, and many ways of doing this, is called cottage industry of writing papers about vectorization. But so I think the first grandfather example, possibly, certainly the one that has gained a lot of traction, is persistent landscapes developed by Peter Bubenick. And the idea is for each bar in your barcode, you turn it into a 10 function, and then you aggregate these 10 functions in ways. So you turn your barcode into a collection of functions, and you could do statistics on functions, and happy days. But the whole point of this is, okay, we turn it into an object where you could do statistics on. Okay. And we're taking off a list of desirable properties to satisfy the two invariants in the first step and the second step. The third step, the third item, continuity. So both these two steps are continuous transformations. So this whole thing is continuous. And if you again drop this k equals 0 thing, drop commands on higher derivatives and only look at continuous embeddings, this whole thing is also two Lipschitz. And it's a monogeneric subset of embeddings. So and I'll expand on this in a bit. So we called a theorem that we proved earlier that the smooth embeddings with finitely many non-degenerate critical points are generic. So if an embedding has causal distance transform with there's Morse as finitely many non-degenerate critical points. If it's Morse, then we could assign to each endpoint of the barcode a unique critical point. And finitely many critical points imply finitely many intervals. And as a corollary, so smooth embeddings generically have finite barcodes. So we've shoved this loop through this pipeline. We've got something out that's finite, that's tame generically. Great. Maybe I should expand on that point I glossed over, which is how you could assign these endpoints of the interval to critical points. So if you remember, so this number 2 corresponds to the cycle born when I pass through that saddle point. So, and that maxima that kills off that cycle corresponds to that maximum. So there's you could really formalize this very concretely, so where the minima of these functions correspond to birth of connected components of sublevel sets, and saddles are the birth of one cycle is a merger of connecting components. And the maxima are, shouldn't be connected, but the maxima are depth of one cycles. And that's a typo. And so if someone throws you a barcode, right, and so you could actually interpret the ends of these intervals in very concrete ways that they correspond to saddle points with. And you could then say saddle point, okay, if it's a saddle point, it has to be these geometric features. So it summarizes information about the saddle points, maxima and minima of the function. So some outlook. So other things that we've done in this project we haven't had time to cover. So we have a similar story to tell in a piecewise linear case. And it's really retelling the story in the setting. and we're able to sort of relate sort of these critical points, sort of angle defects along these curves. And then we are also interested in higher order cases. So a much harder problem. So one generalization of, for example, the chordal transform is rather than looking at chords along the circle, we look at these convex hulls of points. So writing 2 points, we pick 3 points. And then we look at the simplex spanned by this. And we measure the 2-dimensional or higher dimensional area for this function.
What do you mean the endpoint configuration space?
So I mean RAN n. So
no, so there's a result that says the sort of RAN mass then is smooth structure, but you don't get but you don't get a width structure.
Yeah.
Or it's not known
Okay.
if you have a width.
Okay, so it is connected swept.
Yeah,
it
is connected swept. It's not, yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, and nobody knows what conically smooth swept that means. These articles are get it wrong. But okay, good. No, but I think you can get data, no? Anyway, let's stop it.
Yeah. So see, n-gradient 2 already much more complicated case mathematically to consider, but obviously these contain a bit more information than just looking at the distance of chords. Some future work along the line. So obviously, want to look at applications to some biological data, we look at this data set, and this is some work that Otto did. So we pushed our loops, these cancels through our pipeline, and then we looked at the principal components of persistent landscapes, and then they seem to be able to distinguish between 2 different types. But then, so loops are one thing, and then so there are other shapes in the wild, and spheres. No, we've got done S1, then let's look at S2. And the space, rather than Möbius span, is a complex projective plane. It's a 4-dimensional manifold. And the interest in this is, you could describe a whole lot more. The cells are not really 2D shapes. It's only 2D when you sort of put under a microscope. Cells are really 3D things. For example, tissues are 3D things whose boundary can be modeled by S2. And this paper by Liz Munch, I use ECT, molecular characteristic transforms, to look at shapes of body cells. And you like to think that so these can be described as embeddings of spheres. So I'll just stop on that summary. So this is, again, grateful to work with James and Otto. So James is here if you also fancy a chat with him about this work. And yeah, hopefully you've enjoyed this talk and happy to take any questions.